this is a no-no.
So you think you're a car expert, or are you just getting started under the hood? Either way, I'm gonna go over 7 super common DIY mechanic mistakes that I see all the time. So let's dive in and see if you're nailing it already or making these classic blunders. And make sure you stick around to the end, because I'm gonna share a couple unconventional tools that I really love and use all the time. First mistake I wanna talk about is when people improperly jack their car up. Starting with this one, I think a lot of people know that, you're supposed to put the jack under the body right here on this ridge. What a lot of people don't know is that there's actually 2 specific spots on each side of the car, at the front and the rear, that's reinforced that the jack is supposed to go. If you put it here or in the middle somewhere, it's thinner metal, it's called a pinch weld, and it can actually bend. So you'll actually wreck your car and potentially your jack could slip. A dangerous mistake I see people make with jacks is when they have a higher vehicle and they want to get their jack on a lower point, they'll often use something like a control arm, which is actually sometimes slanted or becomes slanted as the vehicle is lifted, which can make the jack slip out and away and drop the vehicle on you. So you never want to put it on something slanted like control arms or even leaf springs or anything like that. You want to make sure that it's a jacking point and that it's flat. The next mistake I want to talk about is when it comes to buying replacement parts. The thing I see all the time is when people are getting ready to work on their car, they go online or they go to the auto parts store and they put in their year, make, and model, and they just assume that the catalog is going to give them the right parts. Oftentimes, you don't find out until you got your car torn all apart in the garage that the part that got sent to you in the mail or that you ordered at the store is the wrong one. Now, the reason this happens is sometimes the catalogs are just wrong and they have the wrong part listed for your car. It can also be user error. For example, I've seen people go in and give the wrong year that their car is because on the registration it says 1 year, but they don't realize it was actually manufactured the year before. What I recommend, if possible, is to get a really good visual confirmation of the part you're taking out before you buy the new one. So that could mean just taking a picture with your phone of a part that's on the outside of the engine, like say your alternator, or if it's something more hidden in the engine, if possible, taking it out. That way you can have it in your hand when you're at your computer buying the new part, or when you go to the auto parts store, you can actually compare it to the new part that you're buying even before you buy it and make sure it's the right one. If you haven't already, subscribe to Budget Mechanic. You don't want to miss out on all the upcoming content. Now, speaking of buying parts, a lot of people go online and just try to buy the cheapest part that they can find. Now, this is Budget Mechanic, and I do buy cheap parts online sometimes, but getting the cheapest part can bite you in the butt sometimes. Now, usually these cheap parts online are aftermarket, they're not made as well, not gonna last as long, which is maybe okay if you're doing something simple like a coil or a windshield wiper reservoir. You can just buy another one if it breaks. Where you don't want to cheap out is on stuff that would potentially damage your engine if it breaks, like say a timing belt kit. Don't want to cheap out on that. Another thing to think about is if the job itself is really difficult and you got to tear apart half the engine to get to that part, you do not want to put a cheap aftermarket part in there because you're just going to be doing that job all over again much sooner than you would have had to. So in those cases, just buy the OEM part. It's going to save you a ton of time, money, and big headaches in the future. And when it comes to putting the new part in, what I always do is, like I said before, being redundant here, but you want to compare the new part that you bought to the old part that you've taken out, because there's nothing worse than leaning over trying to get that AC compressor in, not realizing that the bolt holes are slightly different on the one you bought and you're never going to get it in. The next mistake we're talking about has to do with battery handling. So what some people neglect to do is to disconnect their car battery when they're working on electrical things on their car. And that's especially important for things like starters and alternators, which have a direct line from the positive terminal of the battery right to those devices. So if you forget to disconnect the battery and you're working on your alternator and your wrench touches the engine, you're going to get showered in sparks and you could actually end up damaging something. Now, speaking of disconnecting the battery, a lot of people know they need to disconnect the battery before certain jobs, but they often reach for the positive terminal to disconnect because they think that's the one where the power is. The proper way to do it is to remove the negative side of the battery. And actually, once you disconnect that, the electrical system is disconnected. You don't need to do the other one. Now, the reason for this, you may know if you watched our other videos, is because the negative terminal of the battery is actually connected to the car itself. So the entire car is part of the negative side of the battery. So if you go to take the positive side off first and you're wrenching around and you hit your wrench on something metal, it shorts out the battery, you get lots of sparks and heat, and it can be really dangerous. But if you touch the wrench while you're working on the negative terminal, nothing bad happens, and once that's disconnected, there's no more power running from the battery. One good way to remember to take your negative terminal off first is to do what your therapist says. Get rid of that negative, keep the positive. Another thing people do is they don't realize that the battery terminals are often tapered, so they tighten the battery clamps right at the top, and they're not actually fully tight, and your battery terminals get loose, and then that causes problems. What you really want to do is to make sure that your clamp is completely loose first, beat it all the way down to the base of the post, then tighten it up and make sure it seats really well. The next mistake I want to talk about, in my opinion, is if you're someone that wants to work on your own car on a regular basis, you need to go out and get a decent scan tool. Now, I've often sent people to the auto parts store to get a free code red, and it's great for one-off things. But if you really want to get serious about fixing your own car, you need to know your way around a scan tool. So having someone else do it for you is not going to get that job done. In addition, if you're taking your car down to get scanned by someone else, there's a couple things you miss out on. You don't get live data, which is something that's actually really important for diagnosing certain problems. They're only going to give you the snapshot data of an engine code, whereas things like oxygen sensors really benefit from live data tracking. And lastly, there's some repairs where I end up using the scan tool a lot for that one repair. So I'll scan the code to find out what it is, I'll do the job, then erase the old trouble code, then I'll want to drive the car a bunch and recheck with my scanner to make sure that everything's okay. Now, if I had to depend on an auto parts store for each step of that process, I'd be driving back and forth all over the place, and it really wouldn't be worth the money I'd saved by not getting a scan tool. Now, you don't have to spend a ton of money to get a decent scanner. Just make sure it's got that live data. Fixing the elements of your steering and suspension on your car is super common as a mechanic. The mistake I see is people replace these components and don't realize they need to get their car aligned afterwards. And this can lead to dangerous drivability issues and at the very least prematurely wearing out tires, which can be really expensive. So the common culprits that people would work on that would affect their alignment are lower control arms, sometimes upper control arms, outer tie rods, and inner tie rods. And these all have adjustments on them that allow you to pick how your tires are pointed or tilted. So as you can imagine, if that gets really out of whack, you would go down the highway and your car is actively trying to pull you off the side of the road, or when you're braking, it brakes really uneven. So that's why it's really important that your car is aligned properly. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't work on your own suspension or steering. It just means that you need to be aware of what you're doing and that something that you're changing might throw off your alignment. And if you're careful, you can mark the components really well before you take them apart so that when you put things all back together, you can actually get really close to what your alignment was before. We made a really good video on replacing your tie rods where you can actually mark things in a way that you can maintain that alignment when you're putting stuff back together. We'll put that in the link above. The next mistake I want to talk about has to do with nuts and bolts. A lot of people, when they're working on their engines, they don't want stuff to fall off or come apart, so they over-tighten nuts or bolts. And that can lead to some serious problems. For example, this valve cover is held on by lots of these little 10mm bolts. It's a pretty common job, but they don't have to be that tight, and it's really easy to over-tighten these when you put them back in. And what can either happen is you snap the bolt head off, or you rip the threads, you strip the threads right out of the aluminum head of the engine. Both of those things are real serious problems and are a huge headache to repair. If you were to snap off a bolt down here on the side of the engine somewhere, there's been cases where you actually have to pull the motor out of the engine in order to drill that broken off bolt out. Now, this is especially easy to do obviously with the smaller fasteners. My rule of thumb is generally I get things snug and then I take it another quarter turn past that. And if you're really not confident in your ability to do that properly, maybe time to get a torque wrench. Now, another thing people do is the opposite. They under-tighten things. Maybe they're afraid of stripping or snapping bolts off, so they don't tighten things enough. And this can be especially bad if you're working on parts of the engine that hold oil or maybe water or coolant, where you'll start to get leaks if things are under-tightened. Another naughty thing people do with nuts and bolts is they cross-thread them. Classic example is lug nuts and the studs that the lug nuts go onto. They often get started kind of crooked, and then people either use an impact or a big wrench and just force them on the wrong way. And usually that leads to what happened here, where the stud that sticks out from the hub snaps off inside the lug nut, making them both useless. So in that case, if you were to snap off a stud inside of a lug nut, you'd have to pull off the wheel, the caliper, the rotor to get to that broken off stud to fix it. So just really important anywhere on your engine, when you're putting fittings on, you want to hand start them first and make sure they go on really easily before you apply force. Next mistake I see people make is cheaping out on the tools that they buy. Now I know it's really tempting to get on Temu. You can get some really amazing deals there on tools, or you walk into Walmart and there's like the $5 tool bin. You can get an entire socket set for $5. But in my experience, it's just not worth it. Because if you get halfway through a job and your cheap ratchet breaks, well then you're stuck. You're either got to go buy a new one or you're bugging your neighbor to borrow his. So if you're planning to work on your car on a regular basis, it just makes sense to invest in a basic set of good quality tools. Now, in my opinion, that doesn't mean that every tool you own has to be a snap-on and cost tons of money. I do think your basic hand tools need to be good quality. So like your wrenches, your ratchets, your pliers, stuff like that needs to be really solid. Now, things that I don't use all the time, I tend to spend a little less money on. For example, this voltmeter. It was like 10 bucks. I use it every once in a while for like 2 basic functions and it works great. I didn't have to spend $400 on a fluke meter. My 1/8 inch drive impact, I use this thing all day long, every day. I got a high quality one and it served me really well. You could probably get a similar tool to this on Temu for like 25 bucks and I guarantee it will let you down and break within a year. Speaking of tools, like I promised in the beginning, there are some tools that I wouldn't consider essential, but that have saved my butt more than once. One, right angle needle nose pliers. Engine compartments can be super cramped, and so it's really hard to get needle nose pliers in some of those areas, and that's where these come in. Being able to reach around hoses and get behind stuff to do the grabbing. Also the fact that they make these things pretty long, like way longer than a normal needle nose, and it just is more helpful than you'd think. Another one I want to share with you is these box wrenches that have the ratcheting end in them. Love them so much. So you pay a little more for them, obviously, but it gives you the ability to reach down and reach a bolt in a tight area and ratchet it out instead of having to like turn, remove, reset, turn, remove. Man, this goes so much faster, saves me so much time. Love these things. Thanks for watching. If you can think of any other common DIY mechanic mistakes, make sure you let us know in the comments. If you like this video, you're gonna wanna check out the other one we made on the top maintenance mistakes that people make with their cars.